Welcome everybody, thank you for joining. Welcome back. We're going to be learning a little bit today on the topic of understanding the Hakadosh. Before we get there, I want to first say a huge mazel tov to the Berger family on welcoming Avraham into the family. We're looking so happy at this moment. Be'ezras Hashem, we have a look forward to really continued simcha and joy for the two of you, Be'ezras Hashem, for many wonderful years to come. I want to also take a moment to thank those who are sponsoring our learning this morning. I want to thank Rosemary Fish, who is sponsoring the learning upon her safe return from Israel for 8 weeks. Rosemary, we missed you, and we're so happy that you're back. And Be'ezras Hashem, we're looking forward to learning together for many more wonderful weeks together. We're also thank Sori Stone, who's sponsoring today's shir for 2 yard sites. The first is her grandfather, Chaim ben Nesanel, and her aunt, Nechama bas Chaim as well. Just a little bit of backdrop as well. Sori describes her grandfather as a person who brought Daf Yomi to the 5 towns, which was starting the White Shul in 1974. So to count the amount of Daf Yomis we have today, it has started somewhere. And had the Gabbai the Rishon in Torah Vadas. He used to be the Gabbai in Torah Vadas when it was in Williamsburg, and when he retired, he would take Sfarim and Shemos and insert missing pages and rebind them, and replace them on the shelves of the White Shul Beis Midrash. That's always one of the things in shuls. It's nice to get new Sfarim, but what happens when they need a little bit of help to be used again with all the holiness and the years of learning as well? His daughter was Norma Feller, whose yahrzeit we're also learning for, was one of the local artists, and she made many talis ataras and canvases and sisterhood awards, and which will adorn her home in the 5 towns. And she was a person who had a warm and smiley disposition. So we're learning Nishmas Chaim ben Nesanel and Nechama bas Chaim Nishmasehem Eden. Thank you for making this the context to learn for them as well. So let us start. We're going to try to unpack another of the Mefarshim on the page of our Chumash. And it's so hard to choose because there are so many. We've spent time looking at the Targum, at Rashi, at the Rashbam, at the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban. So where do you go from there? And there's so much to decide. So I want to thank Dr. Yeager for suggesting we go in the direction of the Hachaim next. We can. There are so many options, but this week that is the direction we're going in. Let us start together. The Hakadosh was, we're now moving centuries later from where we were up to now. The Ramban and Nachmanides living in Spain and Israel already in the time of the Rishon and the medieval commentators. We're now moving later. We're moving into a different continent. We're moving into Morocco. And we're going to study the life of a person by the name of Chaim ibn Attar, Rav Chaim ibn Attar. He was born in the year 1696 in Morocco, in a city called Saleh or Sali. He was born into a rabbinic family. His grandfather's name was Rav Chaim ben Attar as well. The family's name was Attar, and he spent time learning with his grandfather. How could he learn with his grandfather if he was named for his grandfather? Because he was Sephardic, and the Sephardim name after patriarchs and matriarchs in the family. So he learned with his namesake for many years, and that's where he got his tutelage at this time. Remembering at this point in time, in the 1600s and the 1600s, Morocco was a big settlement of Jews. Why is that? Because a lot of the Jews were also, the Morocco community is very ancient, but following 1492, this was one of the destinations across the Mediterranean Sea south where many of the Jews escaped from Spain. So there's a large community there, a very illustrious Jewish community, which really went on for many years, and just until half a century ago, upon the last 60, 70 years, when the Declaration of the State of Israel became harder and harder for Jews to live there. Ironically, Morocco has done an about face today, and Morocco has done an incredible amount of work of reconstituting the Jewish communal centers and history. They've opened up museums today about Moroccan Jewry. This is the Moroccan government doing it today. They've normalized with Israel, despite efforts of mobs today to try to destabilize that. But there's a lot that's going on. Eric, I think you went there a number of times. So Morocco there's a lot of incredible Jewish history. So in Sali, this young man, Rav Chaim, actually grew up, and his trade was a goldsmith. He used to actually take gold and be able to take the gold and thread it into threads of garments. We'll get back to that in a second why that's important. He spent his time supporting himself enough to be able to get by, and then at the same time teaching Torah. He was a prolific teacher of Torah. With the death of his father-in-law in the year 1725, became more complicated because he inherited the estate, but also the complaints and the jealousy and the taxation officials of the government, and which forced him to take a detour. And there were many complications along the way. There was a drought. There was a locust infestation. All kinds of complicated things, forcing him to ultimately flee to Marrakesh and later on to Fez. And at a certain point in the year 1739, after a number of complicated travels, he decided that it was time to move to the land of Israel. So he and his students, his pupils around him, decided that this was the time to move to the land of Israel. So what did he do? He moved first across the Mediterranean north to a very important Jewish center at the time, which is Livorno. Right, Livorno is a very, very important Jewish place. It's ironic. Whenever the Jews are in a place that it's a very big population, we always think this is the center of the world and nothing's ever going to change. Well, go to Livorno today. There's nothing there right now today. But in those days, this was the center. It was a port town. It was a center of culture. And in fact, if you look at many of Jewish publications, you'll see the printing was done in Livorno as well. It was a very, very large Jewish center of the world. He spends 3 years there, and his goal is, that's when he actually ends up publishing the Sefer that we're going to be examining right now, among others, called the Or Hachaim, the light of Chaim, of life, but obviously, you're putting his name in there as well, the light that he is bringing to the world, which is a lot of light. And at the same time, he actually befriends many of the financiers in Livorno to finance the operation that is about to the expedition is about to go on, which is to set up a yeshiva in Yerushalayim. He believes he needs to go to Yerushalayim, he needs to take his students. That's a significant financial undertaking. And we're not talking about admissions and tuition. We're talking about somehow the diaspora community supporting this. He spends 3 years doing that. And he, with the yeshiva, it's going to be known as Knesset Yisrael. And he decides he's going to go to Israel. He gets the financial support, which, by the way, he talks about in his introduction to Hachaim. He talks about 4 gentlemen who are bankrolling his operation, that are supporting his movement. Ultimately, they make their way from Livorno to Alexandria on a ship, and from Alexandria they intend to go to the port of Yaffo, to go to Jerusalem. The captain of the ship instead takes them to Akkar, the further north in Israel. Very disappointed, but it turns out there was actually at the time a plague in Yaffo and Jerusalem, so they were saved at that point in time from illness. They spent a little bit of time in Akkar. And in the first few months of being there, 2 of his party of 30 pass away, an elderly person and a young person, and he feels this is not correct. He feels that it's because Akkar itself is questionable as to whether it's actually within the bounds of ancient Israel, right? That's because it's further north. There's a question as to whether that is proper Israel of antiquity. So he decides to move to Pekiim, goes to Tveria. Rav Chaim Abulafia, who is the elderly statesman Rav of Tveria, asks him to bring his yeshiva and start there. He will give them more wherewithal. He'll give Rav Chaim Ibn Attar the reins of Tveria, and the Or Chaim decides not to stay there because he has made his promise to those of the benefactors that he's going to go to Jerusalem. And despite the fact that Jerusalem is more difficult and there's less there in terms of structure and in community, he decides it's important. He goes to Yerushalayim, he sets up his yeshiva, and we can read about it because some of his students have diaries of their trips, so we can read about the diary as they describe this process. He goes to Yerushalayim, and by the way, when he was in the north, he spends a bit of time visiting Kivrei Tzadikim, so many of the graves. The first one he goes to is a person by the name of Hushai Ha'arki. So for those who study Tanakh, you know who he is. For those who don't, it's important that you study Tanakh. Hushai Ha'arki is an ally of David HaMelech, who is able to annul the words of Achitophel when David HaMelech is escaping from Yerushalayim. He's buried in the north, and they go and learn the sections of Tanakh relating to Hushai Ha'arki at his grave. And they go, and there's a number of different places they go. They finally make their way down to Yerushalayim. He sets up the yeshiva, and after this period in time, in the year 1742, so we're talking about not much long later, on the 15th of Tammuz, he passes away on a Motzei Shabbos. He spends less than a year ultimately in in Israel, having established this, and his students continue his legacy, dying at a young age. So we're talking about really 40, how we talk about this, 47 years, right? So a very, very short lifespan, but an incredible amount of achievement. Hachaim is not his only book he writes on the Gemara as well, but the Hachaim has become very famous. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to try to look at this work and try to understand what he's doing, why he's doing it, and how it differs from what we've been looking at up to now. It is very, very different to anything we've seen. It's a different trajectory of ideas and expression of those ideas as well. First of all, let's just take a look at one snippet from his introduction, where he describes how he is writing this book. In the first source, he describes the climate under which he is espousing these ideas. V'hamu alai sa'aros, and there were many storms about me. Yemei ha'moinim, the days of prevention. V'lo shavu harodfim, and those who oppressed me and persecuted me did not relinquish. Kivisi l'shalom, I was hoping for peace. V'nei milchama, and it was war. Ratz achar ratz, it was running after running. Letzar v'letzorer, tzara nogas b'cheverta. And he says one difficulty followed the other, meaning it wasn't even a reprieve between difficulties to breathe. It was one difficult thing after another difficult thing. Aba'ad hatzavar higia v'nadadati mi'ir le'ir v'niskaim bi hanimlat min apachad yipol al pachas. And he says that I was going from city to city, desperately trying to escape all my persecutors and those who gave me difficulty. And I was, in fact, known as the refugee who's falling into traps. That's how he describes his life. So during this time, he describes how, nonetheless, he still tries to find the way of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the way of Hashem, and to find and to concentrate and to meditate upon the ideas of God. So the circumstances under which he's writing this are less than ideal. And ironically, sometimes some of the greatest works during Jewish history have been written under such circumstances. And sometimes even perhaps the success of their works are related to the difficulty under which they wrote them, which is really fascinating to appreciate this as well. One other very notable example of this, is the Taz and the Shach, who on the Shulchan Aruch in Yeridea, who wrote their commentaries under persecution in the Ukraine, right? So and they write about this. So there is a number of different works which have this hallmark. He now makes a very interesting observation, which up till now is not going to be the convention of the way to study and to teach. This is also in his introduction about the way he is going to render ideas. So listen to this remarkable point. And I wonder if this relates to a different school of thought today in terms of studying of Torah, which we don't often see. And I guarantee that most people in this room have not been schooled with this idea. And listen to what he says. When examining ideas in source 2, he says, when I opened the book of God, right, when I opened up the Torah, I didn't spend all that much time when writing my book by reading other people's books before me. I didn't spend the time looking at everybody else beforehand, and their resolutions of the problems, ואכניס טפח ואפרש פירוש ממוצע מביניהם, ולא זה יקרא אחיו אל נחש הקדמוני, כי יערים להתנגד. So, what is he concerned about here? Does anybody understand why would he not do that? What's he motivating him to do this? Right, his concern is plagiarism, but I think it's less in terms of we'll call the legal parameters of plagiarism. It's more because he doesn't want his ideas to be tainted by their answers and then perhaps try to co-opt part of their idea, and therefore the idea he is rendering is therefore not an original thought. That's a remarkable perspective. Today, there's no breath, right? So we have the pasuk, and then we're taught, here is what this means based on Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, we go on, and we're automatically in Rashi. And I remember one of my teachers saying is like, what happens if you didn't have Rashi? Like Rashi didn't have Rashi, right? So what would you do? How would you resolve this? I think that most people don't give themselves the chance to think. There are individuals and schools of thought that do this. So for instance, if one goes to the Yeshivat Har Etzion, the Machon Herzog way, that's very much sort of like, let's just take away assumptions and let's try to understand. Similarly, if you look at the works of Rabbi David Foreman through Aleph Beta, a lot of his work is doing that without the preconceived notions of Mefarshim. The problem, just to point out the danger of this school of thought, is that it allows people who perhaps are less schooled, are less encultured, meaning the Hachaim, it wasn't that he never learned Rashi. He learned all of Rashi. He learned all of the Ramban. But when he was writing his Pirush, he was not reading it before he wrote his Pirush. That's what he's saying. And today, unfortunately, we have a lot of people who think they're the B'nai Hachi, right? Who think that they have the gravitas to render ideas, and they simply don't. And they're coming in with just missing basic concepts in Judaism in their interpretation. So that's the danger in that, because they say, I should be the same. It's kind of like a first grader saying to, a orthopedic surgeon and saying, I think it should be done differently. It's like, I think you should go back to school, right? So we have to be careful about where it is. But however, let's say you've now graduated medical school and now you've had a fellowship and you want to have an opinion, you have an opinion based on your experience. Maybe it's better not to necessarily compare, and right, that's what he's saying. Okay, so that's where we're at. But understand that this is what he's trying to do over here, which will actually now render ideas which we have not seen beforehand. So as opposed to many of the later Achronim, so like as you go further and further and further, most ideas are saturated in earlier ideas. And it's not as easy to find those who are more, we'll call it creative, and render new ideas. The Hachaim is going to do that, and that's because of this point of his methodology. We're going to examine some examples. So the first, I'd like just to a few pieces of how he puts his ideas together. One is the Hachaim is so famous for having multiple ideas on one pasuk. And let me give you an extreme, okay? The pasuk says the beginning of Parshas Bechukosai. The reason why the Parsha is called Bechukosai is in Bechukosai Teilechu v'esmitzosai tishmaru v'asisem osam. Right, so it describes if you will follow in my statutes and walk in my statutes and guard my mitzvahs and do them, and then there's the ... the etc. is these are the blessings. Right, good. That's what it said. The Hachaim over here says, and I'm going to quote you the third rendition of his interpretation. His Od Yirtzeh in source 4 Al Pi Ma'amaram. He quotes the Zohar. We're going to get to his quotation of the Zohar, which again is explicitly Kabbalistically. Ki Torah yesh bo daled drachim. There are 4 ways in the Torah. Hachaim Shat, Remesh, Drus, Sod. They are what's called, and of course the English word paradise, of course, is a expression of the idea of paradise. Paradise literally means an orchard. The English, we'll call rendition or transcription of that is paradise. So paradise is the words paradise, Pshat, Remesh, Drus, Sod, which means there's 4 levels of interpretation: the explicit, the hint, the drash, and the sod. And by the way, the Hachaim will utilize all 4. And he'll tell you he's utilizing all 4 at various times. So he'll be creative enough to suggest an idea which in Pshat would be in the realm of the Rashbam, meaning he'll have the audacity to say ideas in understanding the Pshat which are completely unique, but still be willing to dip into Remez, Drush, and Sod. And he's going to tell us that as well. So he is operating on multiple tiers, and he goes on to say, he says, therefore, Umei Elu Nifrudu Al Ayin Ponim. From these 4 levels, now this widens into 70 different facets, as we know from the Gemara. And each one of them has tributaries. So what does that mean? Means to say, in all the interpretations of my ideas, Hashem says, you'll walk, then you will be blessed with it, and then the continuation of the beginning of Bechukosai. Note, by the way, I'd like to make the observation that this observation that he's making now is actually attached to a story, a very famous story in his life. And there are many stories in his life. And I'd like to make the observation that most stories you hear about the Hachaim are supernatural. There's an extraordinary amount of supernatural stories associated with the Hachaim and even visiting his grave. There are many stories associated with visiting his grave. Where is the tombstone of the Hachaim, by the way? Har HaZeisen. You can easily visit it. I mean, not so easily, depending on your level of feeling safe out there or going with a party. But there are remarkable stories to be told around the kever of the Hakadosh. We'll get back to that later. But most stories we hear about the Hachaim are extremely supernatural, right? By the way, who's one of his students? the Chida. Rav Chaim Yosef David Azulai, also prolific author, more Sfarim than most people even get to read. But nonetheless, remarkable individual. So just to understand, the story goes as follows. This is the story. The story goes that when he was serving as a Rav in the Kehillah in Sali, right, in his earlier years, or Saleh, he was also the Av based in, and it happened to be that there was a particular Shabbos in which most of the meat that was shechted that week was found to be treif. Remember, this is not going to the supermarket and getting your refrigerated package that has been on a freezer truck from somewhere, some plant out in Iowa to come here, which is now just perfectly waiting for our cholent cut, right? To be put inside. In those days, there would be a shoichet, and the shoich without refrigeration, the shoich would bring the cow into town, and bring the chickens and slaughter a few, and people will take the meat and salt the meat and bring it. Right, this would be a whole process just to get to the Shabbos meal, right? So, by the way, Hachaim was very involved in the kashrus of the city as well. He was very concerned about the way that people were checking lungs in those days, because you have to check certain parts of the animal to ensure that the animal was not terminally ill. Turns out that week, all of the meat happened to be treif, except for the meat that was for his table. So what he did was he felt that he wanted to distribute it first. That those who were the sages of the city should first have a piece of his meat. So he gave away what he had. And there was a very rich individual who came in and said, "I'll buy some." And he said, "I'm taking care of distribution. You have the only kosher meat this week because everything else had failed." And then a number of poor people came in as well, also looking for food, and he was distributing it to them. And this man was very upset. I usually buy what I need and I get what I want. And there was an impoverished man who was trying to get a small portion so they should have meat on Shabbos. And this man insulted him as well. Now, Hachaim, which generally was his perspective, stepped back. He didn't like to engage, even when people insulted himself. He didn't engage because he felt that it would come out as a bias towards his own response and anger. As a function of this, he received a dream. From this, he received a dream, and there was a message that was relayed to him that because you did not stand up on the honor of this individual, you are liable for punishment. Meaning he didn't stand up for this poor person who was being berated by the person who felt that he had the rights to buy this meat at any price. And as such, he declared upon himself galus. He declared upon himself personal exile, and so he spent a number of weeks leaving anonymously and just moving from town to town as a function of the fact that he did not feel that he realized that he did not do what was requisite in defending this person. And so the story goes that he arrived in a particular town anonymously, Erev Shabbos, and he's taken in by somebody who's willing to have a guest for Shabbos, wonderful, and he is sitting at the Friday night table. They finish the meal, and this fellow says, "Let's go to hear the Chacham, who's a wonderful person, the Hachaim in the city, who says a Dvar Torah after the Shabbos meal at night." So off they go to the synagogue, they go to the shul, and the Chacham is sitting there, and all the people come back after their meal to listen to it. And he said, I apologize, I skipped one detail of this, is that it turned out to be that week was Parshas Bechukosai. And as he's traveling, the Hachaim Hakadosh goes to sleep on a Thursday night, and in the morning he thinks about and he comes to the realization that there are 42 different understandings of the first pasuk of Bechukosai. 42 different explanations, independent explanations. And he is contemplating these ideas. He arrives at the city in the meantime, and come fast forward Friday night, he's sitting with the Chacham in the shul, and the Chacham said, in a dream last night, I dreamed that there were 42 new explanations of the first pasuk on this, released by a person by the name of Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar, I will relate the first 14 of them tonight. And as he said this gentleman who's a guest to the town in the back says, Chaim ibn Attar, right? Removing the appellation of Rav, right? Because, of course, why should they call this person Rav? So the guests were the hosts and all the people were there were like, what are you talking about? And they tell the fellows hosting him, you tell this person he's got to have the requisite respect, and fine. So it continues. They come back after the shul on Shabbos morning, and the Chacham sits down to give a shir, and he says, I'm going to release the next 14 that I received in a dream from Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar, and somebody pops up and says, Chaim ibn Attar. At this point in time, they give a final warning to the host and say, if your guest is going to disrespect Rav Chaim ibn Attar one more time, this is it. So Surah Shlishas comes along, and guess what? The last 14 are about to reveal, and interjects the guest, Chaim ibn Attar, instead of Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar. They're so angry, they lock him in one of the rooms in the shul, and they finish their Surah, they do the Zimun, and they do Mariv. At the middle of Mariv, an incredible storm breaks out. Right? The storm is going to rip up the heavens out of nowhere, in the middle of nothing. There's this unbelievable storm which is going on. The Hachaim, who's the Rav of the city, puts down his head, does the She'elas Chalom, and he is told in his Chalom that they are incarcerating Rabbi Hachaim ibn Attar, and because he's not been able to take out Shabbos yet, because he's incarcerated, that is why the neshamas can't go back to Gehinnom at this point in time. Meaning Shabbos is not ended once he's not ended it yet, and they realize to their astonishment that in fact this is Chaim ibn Attar, and he realizes after this insult that was the atonement necessary for his not having taken care of this person. He ultimately is able to return. What is fascinating is you can read them. So I'll just give an example. Here's number 42, right, of these Pirushim. And notice it is completely different to number 3, which we looked at right now. Od yispaer al derech ma she'amru beperek hasocheres hapoalim, because the Gemara b'Mitzia, b'ma'aseahu merabanan she'amar lo le'Eliyahu. He says there's a sage who says to Eliyahu, Siman hakir kisoy shel Rabbi Chia b'ali chasami gan Eden shel mata liyeshiva shel mala. How do you know the pathway that Rabbi Chia used to access the yeshiva shel mala from this world? That Rabbi Chia was so fortunate that he was able to ascend to the upper worlds without any help of any, we'll call it, agencies. No malachim needed to help him. And why was that? The Gemara goes on to say is because Rabbi Chia had a lot of amelos, a lot of involvement and hard work in Torah that allowed him access as well. So therefore he turns back to the pasuk, Im bechu kosai teilechu, as Chazal understand she'amelim b'Torah, that you should be toiling, then there's going to be an easier ascent, like Rabbi Chia as well. Right? So quoting this Gemara as well. Each of the 42 is quite and completely different to each other. This is an example of Orach Chaim. So the Orach Chaim will do this regularly, not always 42, but you can count on the Orach Chaim as having wildly different ideas on one pasuk, and he'll just say this, and he'll says od, and the way he goes about it is od yirmoz, another hint, or od yisba'er, if there's another possibility of understanding, and that's a very common theme throughout the Orach Hakadosh. And in fact, he points out that he is living in the realm similar to that of the Rashbam to a certain degree. If you look at the bottom of source 6, he says, when quoting this pasuk about understanding how Hashem interacts with Adam after the sin, the very last line he says, Ki yesh lechal hadas, you should know, Ki kol hapirushim shanu mefarshim kemashma'us haksuvim kulam tzodkim. Don't think that what I'm telling you are mutually exclusive ideas, because there's multiple tiers of understanding. Right? There are multiple tiers of understanding. We've seen this idea of living with a sort of pluralistic sense, a notion of ideas within one, because that's the 4 levels divided into the 70, which he feels that he is accessing as well. Okay, and in fact, when he's talking about the idea of lack of plagiarism, right, and not examining other authors before he writes his book, what he describes is that when you plant in this garden and you're planting authentically, there's space for a lot to grow. Meaning, if you want to try to understand what you're finding, there's so much here. So this is an example of this as well. What is fascinating is that he's willing, therefore, to also disagree sometimes with other earlier opinions. So take a look at his introduction on source 7. He says, Ukvar galisi da'ati, I've revealed my knowledge. I'm not disagreeing with the earlier ones. I feel even a hairbreadth. Ela sharushus nusona ledorshe Torah leovda lezarah or zarua latzadik ve'erel chachai malas peros lekol zera zarua. I think that, and that's why the example, I'm going to plant this lots of space in this garden to plant ideas and to plant seeds, which, by the way, talks about to the notion of human creativity in interpreting the Torah. Right? It's not just reaping; it's planting. Okay, as well, and he points out that he says that this is Ben Torah rak ledavar halacha el asher yeh shama ruach asher tichnu arishonim achareim lo yeshanu. But I'm not going to disagree when it comes to halacha. We saw a similar thing that the Ibn Ezra said, right? I'm going to offer differences of opinion, but I'm not going to disagree with halacha. And that's what also Orach Chaim says, a similar idea. Take examples. This is a pasuk which has led to the spilling of much ink over the courses of millennia, and that is when it describes the number of children of Yaakov Avinu coming to the land of Egypt. In Parashas Vayigash, it describes that there are 70 souls that come down to Egypt, and yet, if you count them in themselves, you'll notice there are only 69. And if you want to source where the discrepancy is, you go to the division of the 4 of the wives of Yaakov, and you count the children and grandchildren. You'll find the discrepancy is in the children of Leah. That's where the missing child seems to be. If you add up, there's 32. That's the missing child that it seems to be. And so he quotes Chazal saying, who is that 70th child? Yocheved. He quotes another Chazal saying that actually refers to the Shekhinah, Hashem's divine presence. And he says it's very hard to understand both of those for a number of reasons. And he presents a number of those reasons. One explanation is if it's relating to the Shekhinah, then why would the absence be in the children of Leah? Because the Shekhinah shouldn't be in one particular family as well. And then he also asks questions on the suggestion of Yocheved as well, and it relates to ages as well, as we saw Ibn Ezra questioning as well. In the end of the day, he suggests that there's 2 counts. There's the children of Yaakov, and then there's Yaakov himself. And the observation that he makes is the absentee is Yaakov. All right. So are you counting the children, or are you counting Yaakov as well? Very simple explanation, but therefore sidestepping an observation made in Chazal. Now you'll say, how could he do that? The answer is he says there's space. There's space for interpretation. And this over here, as opposed to Ibn Ezra, who believes that truth is monolithic, which means to say that there has to be one truth, and therefore when he sidesteps Chazal, what he's essentially doing is he's actually disagreeing with Chazal. The Hachaim over here is able to play, like the Rashbam in a certain sense, on multiple layers of truth that are coming out of the same way. Similarly, he disagrees with many of the Rishonim. Now, remember, he's not building his Pirush on the Rishonim, but he certainly knows them. So, for instance, multiple times, he will quote, like in source 11, he quotes a pasuk where we're going to skip the pasuk for a second. It's the line in the Hachaim which is very important. The first line, he says, Rishonim lo ha'iru einenu b'ksuvim alalu ki kulan rechokim mishmoah. I remember all the explanations that are suggested for this pasuk, and most people don't. It's hard. They're far from hearing. Now, just understand that's a very far cry from the way that most Achronim talk about the Rishonim. Right? It's very different from the way that the later commentators talk about the earlier commentators. A lot of the later commentators would say, "This is what's said, and there's a few questions, but I don't know, and I don't know what to say." But right, the Hachaim says it doesn't work. It's not fitting in as well, and therefore I'm going to diverge, which is just in terms of his methodology is going to be quite unique as well. We'll see this, by the way, when we have a chance to learn the Abar Benel. Abar Benel does a similar type of thing, where he actually sets up all the previous Rishonim and then shows why they're not correct, and then goes into his own creative space as well. Now, let's go into the Parshanut part of it here. Remember, so he's told us that he's willing to diverge from previous ideas. He is also not going to be relying on previous Sfarim when writing his book, which yields the most remarkable ideas. And I'd like to introduce this idea by a story which is told about his life. I had the question when I was reading a bit of his autobiography, and I appreciate Dr. Yeager. Thank you for checking this out the library for me, the introduction of one of the versions of the Orach Chaim. So in the introduction of this, it's really fascinating just to make this observation, because I read the story, I had a question on the story, and then I realized that he answers it in his Pirush on the Torah. Ready? See how that goes. The story goes that in Saleh Gaini, in his earlier days, he is a goldsmith, right? That's his profession. He works a certain number of hours a week to provide enough money for him and his family, and then he closes the shop and he uses the rest of the time to study and teach Torah. Now remember, again, when you're not talking about today's salaried HR environment, it's very hard to sort of to find that medium. But it turns out that he's a very respected goldsmith as well. He tailors, he takes gold and he's able to weave it into clothes. So it turns out that the sultan of this locale has a daughter who Mazel Tov is getting married, and so he sends his courtiers to this Jew he's heard about, who's very good with gold, and he decides to commission him to make one of the garments that she's going to be wearing for her wedding. Haba Aleinu, we'll see if it's Latova, right? And so the Orach Chaim Hakadosh says, thank you very much, but I've worked out what I need this year, and I don't need the commission right now. I appreciate the opportunity, goodbye and good luck. And I'm sure he left him with a card of somebody else who works in this. But the Sultan wasn't so used to those kind of responses. So he sends them again, and they said, "Listen, the Sultan would really like you too." And he said, "I really appreciate your offer, but we're not going to go there as well." The Sultan is incensed. How could anybody? It's an honor to be asked by me to be commissioned for the daughter of the Sultan's royal garb, and he decrees that the Hachaim, that this Jewish laborer who doesn't obey the Sultan, be thrown into a pit in his yard in which he has lions. Yes, that's the story. And he decides, in order to achieve this, he's going to starve the lions for a week first, and to make sure that it will be quite a spectacle. And that's what he does. And the Hakadosh is manacled and led to the yard of the Sultan, and in his royal garden, and is thrown into the pit, and the lions all come and sit around him as he says Tehillim. This is like it's a famous story about the Hakadosh. And it's remarkable because then the Sultan comes, sees what's going on. This is like, we're talking about biblical proportion miracles, right? This is Daniel level, right? This is he is amazed. He releases the Hachaim, realizing this is a very holy individual, gives him many gifts, and off he goes on his way. And I read the story, and I was like so troubled by the story, because if you remember, we just read a few minutes ago the introduction of the Hachaim to his life, and he describes that there was not even a moment to breathe between the persecutions, right? Meaning, when he inherited his father-in-law's estate, and the debt collectors and the tax collectors, and this and that, and one place after the next, and he ultimately spent so much time moving around in Morocco, and finally to Italy, and then to Egypt and Israel. You're like, well, if the lion thing worked, then why did he have so much difficulty in his life, was the question I had. And then I realized the Hachaim himself answers the question, because this is a philosophical observation the Hachaim makes, which is actually diverges from most Jewish theology up till this point. Just to this, I think you know where I'm going. The Hachaim says the following. Let's put ourselves in the scene. Yosef and the brothers. Yosef is coming down from his father. He's being sent from Hebron to find his brothers. He can't find his brothers. He goes and he finds them in Dotan. As he's approaching, they say, "Look, here's the dreamer. Let's kill him." Interrupts Reuven, and Reuven says, "Whoa, lo nakenu nafesh." He says, "Don't kill him, right? Rather throw him into one of the pits here, right? That's stage one of the operation of salvation." Ultimately, Yehuda then makes a suggestion of sale, but Reuven plans to get him back later, and he's surprised when he's not there. That's what we have over here. So Hakadosh says, wait a second. So let's be sure. This pit, Chazal pointed out, just from the observation of the way the pasuk words, that the pit is empty of water. But so you don't need to say both of those phrases, and so the observation by exclusion is referring to it as other things in it. So it's likely there's scorpions, it's likely there's snakes. So let's go through the logic of Reuven for a second. Reuven says, let's not kill him. Let's throw him into the snake-infested pit. Right, so you've not really sold so much, Reuven, by suggesting that. You're essentially just saying, kill him. Right, so don't kill him, just kill him. That's what Reuven should be saying. So why does that work? Says our Hakadosh, which sounds like a simple idea, but is not a simple idea by any stretch of the imagination, is that what the difference is that the beasts of the field will always obey the will of God, but human beings won't. Which means that by throwing him into the pit, he's now at the mercy of the snakes or scorpions or the beasts of the field, and they won't kill him necessarily if he is so righteous. But you could, which now sounds like so first of all, just appreciate the autobiographical or called reflection over here. Lions weren't the problem; it was the human beings, right? That's the observation over here in his own life. Okay, and I just reflect. That's a very profound observation about it when we see this. But just to understand what the implications of this are, is up till now, the predominant view in Judaism about this kind of question is the following: is based on Rav Sadia Gaon's understanding, which is that murder is the human department and death is God's department. Understand what does that mean? Okay, so that's what how Rav Sadia Gaon bifurcates this based on a pasuk in Yechezkel. Is that if one person picks up a spear and throws it at another person impales them and kills them, the murderer will be held accountable for murder, but the person who died independent of that person throwing the spear, which means that person deserved to have died. It turns out this person elected to be the vehicle of that and therefore be held accountable, but that person by no means was innocent, right? So that's the way that it's meaning to say. Everything is in the framework of God's plan, and no matter what you're going to choose to do, your choice is not whether to change God's plan, but whether to be an active part of it or a passive part of it. That's what the Rav Saadia Gaon is saying. Okay, so there's nothing we can do. Sort of the way the Rav Saadia Gaon will look at it, and this is the predominant view, even today, generally speaking, is the predominant view, which is it's like you're on a ship, right? Do you have the freedom of movement on the ship? So the answer is yes, you can go anywhere in the ship. I mean, except if it was 100 years ago and you're in steerage, But let's say that to today where there's no class distinctions and so on, so you can go anywhere in the ship. But can you leave the ship? The answer is not unless you want to die. I mean, you can't really go outside the ship. So there's a lot of freedom of movement within the ship. So Rav Saadia Gaon is saying is that within the constraints of Hashem's plan, there's a lot of freedom, right? You could choose to go here, you could choose to go there, you can be the vehicle for good, the vehicle for bad, but you can't change where the ship's going, right? That's what's being observed here. Come back for a moment. The Hachaim is diverging from that. The Hachaim is saying is that is true when it comes to the animals. They don't have free will, but it could have been that maybe Yosef didn't deserve to die, and that's why the animals wouldn't kill him, but it could be that the brothers would kill him. That means to say that that's now a more broader expanse of the operation of what we call Bechira in Hashem's plan, right? Human free will can really have a great ramifications. That just understand the profundity of that observation, and that's what he comes from, trying to understand a Chazal interpreting a pasuk and understanding the philosophical applications of this. Phenomenal, yes.
Isn't that the whole concept of Ari Miklak? The person deserved to die, but this messenger goes to the Ari
Exactly.
Miklak because he
Exactly. That's what the Gemara uses. The Gemara uses the terminology Magalgalin Choy V'Yidei Chayev V'Schus Al Yidei Zakai. Is that bad people become the vehicles of bad things, and good people become the vehicles of good things. Well, he's saying more than that. He's saying is that maybe that God had a plan A, and you, through your free will, have the ability to even manipulate the outcome, not just the process. That's what he's suggesting. Yeah, that's a phenomenal idea. Rav Dessler goes into this in greater length, but understand what's being suggested, the ripples of this idea. Let's take another observation.
It's actually a Zohar. That Hachaim is a really the Zohar, so he does have a
from a Kabbalistic perspective. There you go. Fascinating. Just to understand what's being said over here. This is an example of we'll call it a very, very troubling or a thought-invoking idea. Let's go a little further. Another example of the Hachaim Hakadosh, where of what he does is the Hachaim Hakadosh is able to take halachic structures and give deep meaning to it as well. So a lot of times, as opposed to just trying to understand what the pasuk is saying, he'll actually say that this also encapsulates idea. One of my most favorite Hachaim Hakadoshes of all time is this Hachaim Hakadosh. It says that we say this every time we take out the Torah. Says the Hachaim Hakadosh, quoting the Rambam in Hilchos Torah about the halachas of writing a Sefer Torah and mechikas Hashem and erasing Hashem's name. And the Rambam asks a very basic question. He says, I'm not allowed to erase Hashem's name in any Sefer Torah. It's a very significant issue. That's an Isur D'Oraisa to erase Hashem's name. He says, well, what about prefixes and suffixes, the Rambam asks. So for instance, instead of the word Elokim, what happens if it says Elokechem? Right, so Chem at the end is your God. Right? Elokecha. What happens if I erase the Mem at the end there, or the Chaf at the end? Right? That's not really the name itself. Or let's say, for instance, it says Hala Hashem Tigmulu Kol Zos, right, in Parshas Ha'azinu. Hala, that's that Hey Lamed before the Hashem. Can I erase those? Or are those part of the name of Hashem or not? Says the Rambam, it depends if it's a prefix or a suffix. The Rambam says prefixes may be removed, suffixes may not be removed. Suffixes are seen as continuations of the idea. Prefixes are seen as separate precursors and therefore not actually integral to the name itself. You'll notice, by the way, generally speaking, prefixes go to the Shem Havaya, suffixes go to the Shem Elokim. Just interesting enough in terms of that. There's no suffix to the Shem Havaya. Okay? Now, so it says the Hachaim Hakadosh. That being the case, now that's the halacha. That's codified in the Rambam in Hilchos Yosarei Torah. Says the Hachaim Hakadosh, maybe that actually relates to the way we live as well. So for instance, what he says is as following is, V'atem hadvekim, and you who are cleaving, Ba Hashem, that's a prefix, You're cleaving to Hashem. You want to attach yourself to the godly idea. You want to live a life that's worthy of godliness. So it's not enough to be Dveikim Ba Hashem as a prefix. It has to be Elokeichem. And why does the Torah use both names of Hashem there? Is to incorporate not just the prefix of Ba Hashem, but the Elokeichem, which means, ideologically, is when I'm making decisions, am I the prefix to Hashem, or am I the suffix to Hashem? Which means, is God's idea what's leading my life and I follow, or am I leading and God fits into the places that I need to as well? Right, that's the observation making. So again, taking a halachic detail of prefixes and suffixes now translated into how I'm going to live my life as well. That reminds me, there was a story about a fellow who's donating a Sefer Torah, and he decides that he's going to donate a Sefer Torah to the shul. Beautiful, mantle, which is going to relate to going to relate to loved ones and so on. Turns out, as we're getting near the Hakadosh Sefer Torah, the mantle comes out, and the mantle is 3 inches short. It's like, oh, and after all that effort. So he says to the rabbi, they can't shorten the cloth a little bit. Right, so that's the difference between it being a prefix or a suffix, right? Does God fit into your world, or do you fit into his world, right? And that's what the Hachaim is saying over here. So again, taking a halachic, and he does this constantly, where he takes halachic ideas, translates them into the way we live as well, which is just really, really phenomenal. And of course, Kabbalah. So the Hachaim often, it's very hard to find a page in which the Hachaim does not quote Kabbalah, and he quotes the Zohar predominantly all the time, but he does it in ways which are simple and profound as well. So here's one example, which is an extremely profound example, and he just explains it in such normal terms. The Torah describes the Torah describes the birth of a boy, and then the requirement of a bris milah. So Hachaim already notes that there's 2 words used to describe childbirth there, right? It's kisazria v'yolda, right? So there's 2 stages of this. So he makes the observation is based on the Zohar that there are 2 stages of creation as well. There is conception and there is birth, right? So that means to say these are actually related to 2 different stages of the creation of the human being, which means the pulling down of a soul and the attachment of a body to that soul as well. Now, which is fascinating in terms of does a fetus have a soul or not? But what the Hachaim observes is at the beginning of the creation of the human being, even though there certainly is a biological component to it, there is also, we'll call it the spiritual component to it, which is the spiritual creation of an neshama being pulled down to be applied to this body as well. Therefore, says the Hachaim Hakadosh, I will give you a few observations that relate to this as well, which means that thoughts at the time of the initial creation, part of creation, are very significant to the nature of the soul that will be pulled down as well. And the Gemara says this multiple times as well, is thought, when it comes to the earlier stages of a creation, is very significant. Not only is it about physical, biological creation, but the purity of thought is significant. What one thinks about at such times has an impact on the spiritual persona of the soul that's going to be brought into this world as well. That's observation number 1. Observation number 2, he says, and this is again, this is all Kabbalistic ideas, but he makes the observation is that it says, and this is such a profound rereading of this, is that it describes the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha. It says that Avram and Sarai are coming to the land of Canaan, and they come with Hanefesh Asher Asul Becharan. So understood classically by Chazal, that refers to those they have influenced into the way of monotheism who are joining along with them. We don't see them afterwards, by the way, but so much. But that's what it's referring to. Says Hachaim Hakadosh, no. Remember, Avram and Sarai were in fact were barren. They were not able to have children. They were still married, which means to say that they, in a certain sense, they had the capacity of spiritual creation without the physical attachment of a vehicle to that spiritual creation. Which means that every time that they were together, there was Anefesh Asher Asu Becharan. They had disembodied souls. That means to say they were able to create spiritual entities who did not have a place yet to come, and perhaps later on found a vehicle, found a platform to as well. That just sort of talks about the sacredness, the sanctity of relationships, even in the context of lack of there being a product, being a child as well, a physical body for that to be housed in. That's a very different reading of this understanding. This is also within the Hachaim Hakadosh. We'll close with one last observation. This is obviously related very much to the Hachaim. In general, is not only is he moving to Israel at this particular time because he fancies that there's a spiritual movement towards Israel. The Baal Shem Tov at the same time is also sending his Talmudim around this time in the 1700s. The Vilna Gaon at the same time is also sending his Talmudim to Israel. There's a spiritual movement towards Israel around the year 1740. Right, so this is a significant time, not for now, spiritually, why there's a movement towards Israel, the settlement of Israel. The Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon, who also lived just at the same time, were not able to get there. Their students did get there, and the communities of Israel are going to flourish under the Hachaim students, under the students of the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon. They're all realizing that something has happened around this time. And at this point, it's important to realize that there's an element of messianism as well. So, for instance, when the Torah says, "Ki yeh b'cha evyon," when there's going to be among you a poor person, the me'achad achecha ba'achad sharecha, says the Hachaim, b'derech remez, in one of his pshatim, because it's not his own explanation, yirmoz la'ir he'ara gadola al echad amiyuchad shebe'uma she'elav anu mekavim u'tzapim asa yavoy v'hu melech Yisrael meshichenu asher hu evyon kvarnim shala ani. So what does it mean, ki yeh b'cha evyon? It means to say that there's going to be among you somebody who's going to step up and be the Messiah, is going to be the Mashiach, and will come as well. There is a aura, there's an environment of messianism at this point in time. The idea of return to Israel is very much predominant, and the Hachaim didn't just talk about it, he lived it as well with the realization that something was afoot. It's worthwhile noting, and just to conclude this, is that there are many, many stories that happen around the kever of the Hachaim Hakadosh, for those who are interested. There are many stories of couples who could not have children who went to the Hachaim Hakadosh and davened at the kever of the Hachaim Hakadosh. There were stories about during the time of Rommel's desert campaign, when he was moving up towards the mandate of Palestine, that Rav Chaim Shmulevitz went to the kever of the Hachaim that night. That the German army turned around, davening at the kever of the Hachaim for them to turn around, and the storms at Al Arish that happened. And it's also worthwhile noting, for 19 years, the Hachaim's kever was not accessible, because under Jordanian rule, when they controlled Har HaZeisem, the Mount of Olives, the Hachaim's kever was not available. Now, if you look at the Mount of Olives, you'll notice that there is a road in the middle of Har HaZeisem. There was not a road there beforehand. That was made by the Jordanians. They cleared the way of the Jewish graves, because apparently that's not desecration. When it comes to Jews, they built a hotel there. They destroyed tens of thousands of graves there as well. The story goes that the Jordanian bulldozer was trying to get to the area of the Hachaim and fainted, and the next one died when they were trying to do that. And they realized that was not the optimal route to go. The Hachaim's kever is still there, just below. Actually, it's just above the road. It's if that separating road in the middle of the Har HaZeisem. A lot more to learn about. Yeah, it's just below. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. It's just by the road there, and it's just below the road. And so there's a lot to appreciate. But for our purposes, we're seeing a much, we'll call it, richer and broader perspective over here as time goes on. The Kabbalistic ideas, the creative ideas, the theological ideas, the halachic ideas, all merging together into this, where we see something who we really haven't had the opportunity of learning up to now. I hope this is something which is going to enrich our learning.